When watchmakers want to show off what they're really made of, they make their watches complicated, or they make them thin. Well, how about when they make the thinnest and most complicated watches in the world? Today we're looking at timepieces you could use in a vending machine, and at the end we'll find out how the world's thinnest watch ever was made, and how they got down to the thickness of just 2 credit cards, which is coincidentally how many credit cards you need to buy them. Let's take a look at the thinnest watches in the world. Watchmakers have been trying to slim down a bit since they first moved from pocket to wrist, and actually even when they were still in the pocket. Being able to make a movement thin enough to cut paper has long been the mark of a master watchmaker, and so the big boys, like Audemars Piguet and Jaeger-LeCoultre, have been going at it hammer and tong to build the very thinnest. Very small hammers and tongs, mind you. Wind all the way back to the mid-1700s and you had Jean-Antoine Lepine completely reinventing how pocket watches were put together. Previously, components were sandwiched between 2 plates separated by pillars, but he thought that was crap and decided to build directly onto the plate, using bridges to support the parts. It's how movements are still built today, except for some of the absolute thinnest, which you'll see a little later on. Even by the 1920s, as pocket watches stood on their last legs, watchmakers were striving for thinner, with thicknesses reaching just 3mm, which still sounds incredible today. But with a pocket watch, there's a lot more room for activities. In a wristwatch, the challenge is even greater, although I'm sure no match for the absolute planks who put massive suitcases in with the hand luggage. For Jaeger-LeCoultre, there was no greater challenge than proving that smaller is indeed better. I can relate. In fact, JLC still holds the record for the smallest caliber ever, with the 14 by 4.8 by 3.4mm 101, which actually they used really effectively. It certainly satisfied Queen Elizabeth II. And so in 2014, after a period away from making new ultra-thin movements, they thought why not warm into it a bit and do something easy like the world's thinnest tourbillon minute repeater. I will give you the watch's full name since you're just being introduced. It's the Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Minute Repeater Flying Tourbillon Hybris Mechanica 11, and the irony is that at 7.9mm, it's just too thin to write its own name on. And if you're a watch expert like me, then you'll know that since a minute repeater needs lots of layers to do stuff that makes it do the ding real good, that normally even the best ones are about a centimetre thick. For those of you across the pond, that's 18/48 of an inch. You get 566 parts in a space about the size of 2 regulation poker chips stacked on top of one another. And if that wasn't good enough for you, then check this out. For $400,000, it's an automatic too. The rotor weight sits dial side and can be seen through the holes in the dial, which I assume are to make it go faster, or probably to let the chime out or something. But Jaeger-LeCoultre's reign was short-lived, for it was to lose the mantle of thinnest minute repeater just 2 short years later. It still has the thinnest automatic minute repeater with a tourbillon, but really that's just like being the only person with a plum in each hand to balance on their left leg on a Tuesday. Ever since Bulgari bought the rights to Gerald Genter's Octo collection, it's been desperately trying to avoid a repeat of the Daniel Roth thing and ruining it. So a whole bunch of time and effort has been invested in making it the home of the thinnest watches in the world, and that includes the 2016 Octo Finissimo minute repeater. There's a lot of thinking here that's been taken from the Jaeger-LeCoultre, like the compact packaging of the minute repeater and the holy dial to let the demons, sound out. And there's a lot that's been ditched, like the automatic winding and the tourbillon. That brings the thickness down to 6.85mm, more than a millimetre of savings, which coincidentally is how saving feels like post-COVID. Why is a minute repeater so hard to slim down? Because it's just really hard to make in the first place. A typical minute repeater chimes the hour with one of the 2 gongs, quarters with both, that is the number of 15-minute segments that have passed since the hour, and then the remaining minutes get sounded out by the second gong. You can imagine without the quarters, 12:59 would take an absolute age to sound out, and you'd probably lose count along the way. The way it works is a bit like one of those wind-up toy cars you pull back and let go. Each part of the time, that is hours, quarters and minutes, has a corresponding step snail cam that will only allow, in this wonky analogy, that wind-up toy car to be pulled back so far. The more hours, quarters and minutes there are, the lower the step on the snail cam and the further back that wind-up car can be pulled. So when the car is let go, it can travel further, and if there are little bells on the route ahead, it will hit more. Now substitute that car for tooth racks that trigger the gong hammers and you'll have completely forgotten what I was talking about. Given the watch is so slim and leaves little for the gongs to resonate within, Bulgari chose to mount them directly to the 40mm titanium case to use the entire thing as a kind of speaker. There's a pusher on the left side to get it going. It's basically a $200,000 one-way walkie-talkie. You heard right. By ditching the Tourbillon, you not only save yourself a frankly unwearable extra 1.05mm, but $200,000 as well. If Bulgari keeps this up, the thinnest watch in the world should basically be free, right? If you're going to make the thinnest minute repeater in the world, one of the grandest of the grand complications, then it makes sense to make the thinnest perpetual calendar too, because that is also a grand complication, and so why the hell not? Things are a little easier here, but not by much. Switch racks for program wheels and you've mastered all of time. That is, until the year 2100 when the calendar gets a bit broken. Have you ever done a bit of DIY that you've had to fudge a few times to make work? Like, I don't know, replacing a toilet flush mechanism only to find out that now the cistern leaks and actually after all you didn't fix the flush either, so you've had to take the whole thing apart like 3 times. Strangely specific, I know, but go with it. That's what the modern Gregorian calendar is like. The Julian calendar made a best guess at a year being exactly 365¼ days, adding a leap year every 4 years to compensate. With a year actually being more like 365.2425 days, it means that the leap year is kind of like measuring something with your hands and walking over to the gap it's supposed to fit in like that's actually going to work. It's the good enough approach to calendars. Pope Gregory XIII thought this was bullshit because his favourite day, Egg Day, had drifted into the week when he was busy being holy and that, so he modified the leap year system to skip one every 100 years, unless that year is divisible by 400. That's the silicon sealant approach to fixing it. So a perpetual calendar complication can handle up to the leap year no sweat, but falls down when it comes to that skipped leap year every 100 years. Nevertheless, retaining 4 years of memory in its mechanical databanks makes a perpetual calendar a pretty impressive thing, doubly so when, in 2021, Bulgari managed to shrink the 408 parts of the Octo Finissimo perpetual calendar down to just 5.8mm from the previous record of 6.3mm, set in 2019 by Audemars Piguet and the Royal Oak Perpetual Calendar Ultra Thin, and in an automatic too, for just $59,000. Free ultra thin watch, here I come. People who know all about watches get to say things like, did you know the chronograph is actually one of the most complicated mechanisms in watchmaking? It's one of those delightful know-it-all statements I like to crack out from time to time, including now, when introducing the world's thinnest chronograph, the 2019 Bulgari Octo Finissimo Chronograph GMT. Damn Bulgari, back at it again with the ultra-thin watches, and this time with a twist. Apparently it wasn't enough to cram in almost as many parts as the perpetual calendar, but a GMT as well, making this not only the thinnest chronograph in the world, but the thinnest GMT too. And once again, a Pointer Sisters favourite, automatic. Because the chronograph is such a common complication, a lot of people don't give it a second thought. It sits in that no man's land between the grand complications and the day-to-day stuff because its use in pocket watches was so prolific. Think about it, it's an incredibly useful complication. From races to eggs and all in between, a chronograph is the fundamentally most useful feature a watch can have. So useful in fact that they built chronograph watches without the timekeeping element, called stopwatches. With the miniaturization of pocket watches to wristwatches, many of the big manufacturers turned their focus to timekeeping movements only, and the big boys like Patek Philippe also to high complications like perpetual calendars and minute repeaters. The chronograph was too complex to engineer in-house for the prices they sold at, but too popular to ignore, and that's where the third-party manufacturers like Le Mania and Valjoux came in. With the Bulgari Octo, you don't just get a column wheel chronograph for that Kit Kat quality pusher snap, but a pusher-activated hour change that works alongside the 24-hour subdial at 3 to give you both home and local time. With all that taking up space in the movement like an inconsiderate middle seat passenger, the rotor weight is forced out to the edges in a peripheral configuration, skimming around the edge like a guy who hangs around with your group that no one invited. And we're looking good on the price too. The 6.9mm breaking records and not budgets at $17,000. So who do you think has the record for the thinnest tourbillon watch? Ha! Psych, it's not Bulgari. Although the record was taken from the 3.95mm Bulgari Octo Finissimo Tourbillon automatic from 2018, a watch that still holds the record for the thinnest automatic watch and the thinnest automatic tourbillon. No, today's thinnest tourbillon is the recently released 2024 Piaget Altiplano Ultimate Concept Tourbillon, and it is just 2mm thick, the same as 20 sheets of paper. It borrows the architecture from a previous record holder for the thinnest watch, the Altiplano Ultimate Concept, which is the first time we're seeing a deviation away from Lepine's approach to making movements. Pour one out for Lepine. All the watches we've seen so far, and most of the watches you'll ever see, get built onto a base plate, which then sits between the dial, crystal and caseback of the watch. What Piaget wondered was if they could double up the base plate as the caseback, a theory they tested with the 3.65mm Altiplano 900p. And the answer was yes. Yes, they could. Imagine if the Earl of Sandwich had first invented the club sandwich and then Piaget had come along and taken out that middle slice. Counting every single carb, the watchmakers at Piaget shaved those slices down even further to make the 2mm Altiplano Ultimate Concept, and now they've even managed to switch out the standard balance for a tourbillon. Knowing that tourbillons are usually 2 to 3 times thicker than a standard balance, how has Piaget kept the 2mm thickness? By taking the cage that sits around the tourbillon and moving it to the outside. This is known as an annular tourbillon, secured by a ring of ball bearings around the outer edge. Price, however, is on request, so unless they want you to phone up to tell you it's just $5,000, it's not looking so good for our free watch. That's the complications out of the way. Let's get to the real action. The thinnest watch in the world ever, and for always, or up until a few months later when it changes again. We'll start with the world's thinnest watch that's still strictly speaking a watch, at least in the eyes of Lepine, the 2015 Jaeger-LeCoultre Master Ultra Thin Squelette. This was barely 10 years ago, when the thinnest watch ever had a movement that first became the thinnest movement ever all the way back in 1975. When everyone else thought it might be high time to get on board with this whole electricity thing, Jaeger-LeCoultre was like, nah, it'll be fine, and made even more impressive mechanical calibers. It was the 839 back then, and it's now the 849, and this is the movement in the 3.6mm thick $58,500 Master Ultra Thin Squelette. The tiny little caliber is as lost in that watch as a Malaysia Airlines flight to Beijing, padded out with a movement holder doing double duty as the hour markers too. With the intricate skeletonization, it could easily pass as a commemorative coin and can probably be used to unlock a supermarket trolley. But take the time to enjoy it, because it's the last example we're going to see of a watch with a back, a front, and importantly, a middle. It seems 3.6mm is the absolute limit for traditional watchmaking, because from here on out, we'll be entering the murky waters of what passes for a functioning watch. Fair warning to you. Here be fiddly crowns, unreadable dials, and accessories you need to set the watch with and will probably lose and will cost you a fortune. We mentioned this watch, the Piaget Altiplano Ultimate Concept, a little while ago when we talked about the thinnest tourbillon in the world, but I kind of glossed over what a royal pain in the arse it was to develop in the first place. Making the Ultimate Concept, the first watch to hit the 2mm mark, was an exercise in patience, skill, and wondering what the hell was going wrong and why it just wouldn't work. The previous 900p proved the methodology of using the base plate as the caseback, and everything there worked as expected. Although with the Ultimate Concept, pushing everything to the extreme revealed a few things that no one had even considered. For example, to make the base plate as thin as it needed to be, just 0.2mm, as thick as a single sheet of paper, a cobalt alloy was chosen, so the thing didn't bend like a wet noodle the instant someone cinched up the strap. Yeah, but the problem is that when working with incredibly hard metals, you need incredibly hard tools, and after breaking all their tools, the people at Piaget realised they might need better tools. Whoops. And then get this, to build the watch, everything gets dumped in through the front, with the caseback also built up to form the sides and bezel of the case as well, with the crystal affixed in place to seal in the whole bonanza. Except, without the crystal, the watch was running fine. As soon as the crystal got lowered into place, the timekeeping went ape. At first they thought the crystal was fouling on the balance, but it wasn't. After much trial and error and scratching of chins, they discovered that because the balance wheel was operating in such close proximity to the crystal, its movement was generating a static charge and binding the spring together, just like rubbing your hair on a balloon and praying it doesn't make it even thinner. Every single component in this watch posed a challenge, and every single component has to be finessed for every single watch it's built in. The parts are not interchangeable between watches, but even so, and importantly for Piaget, the ultimate concept manages to retain the classic crown setting and winding setup, with hours and minutes on the same axis too. Yeah, you need a tool to get it wound before the heat death of the universe, and the RRP is back to where we started at $400,000, but it's a small price to pay for the thinnest watch in the world that doesn't use the Lepine method but does still function like a traditional watch. Just about. Where it all starts to get crazy is in 2022 with Bulgari's crowning jewel, the Octo Finissimo Ultra, the thinnest watch in the entire world. Imagine that stack of 20 sheets of paper and now remove 2 of them. That's where we're at with the 1.8mm thick Ultra. We're talking optimization to the extreme, because where the Piaget made an attempt to embrace the rules of watchmaking, Bulgari threw them in the trash, set them on fire, then extinguished the flames with piss. You now don't just have one crown, you have 2, the first to set the watch and the second to wind it. And now they're on their side, so they work on the plane of the gear train, rather than needing the direction of motion switched 90 degrees. Oh, and the hours and minutes get their own separate displays, removing the need to have one hand on top of the other, saving precious microns. This thing's saving space like how all those kitchen appliances I bought were supposed to. Unfortunately, at $440,000, the theory of diminishing prices with diminishing dimensions is well and truly out the window. It was, however, still a remarkable achievement that lasted about as long as the NFT fad the laser-etched QR code on the mainspring barrel linked to. Not because the Ultras were folding like air-dried bedsheets, but because RM came and spoiled it all by saying something stupid like, "We've beaten your record by 0.05mm. Okay, now, so take another sheet of paper from that dwindling pile, cut it in half and put half back. And when I say cut it in half, I mean the really hard way. That's exactly how much shade Mille threw at Bulgari with the RM UP01 Ferrari, the world's first time-telling Amex. Describing this thing as a watch is like describing an elephant as a warm-blooded boulder. It's technically right, although the bounds of logic are being stretched to the absolute limit. On paper, it has returned to a single dial arrangement with 2 hands on top of one another, but in reality it's harder to read than American Psycho, out loud, to your grandmother, at her funeral. And its use doesn't get any easier than that, because Mille have upped the twin crown game, so now tools are needed too. Remember the stylus, and how everybody managed to not even lose them, not even once? Well, now you can have that experience with your watch too, because unlike the Piaget, where it aids in speed, the UP01 is basically impossible to use without it. One crown, I'm calling it that like it's actually a crown, changes between winding and setting modes, and the other does the winding and setting. It looks like Mille has included small ridges so you can kind of wind the crowns between thumb and forefinger, but that looks about as useful as a spaghetti screwdriver, which is coincidentally what Mille supplies to wind and set the watch, and it won't cost you even a penny extra over the base price of $1.8 million. How generous. So if someone tries to steal this particular watch off the wrist of Ferrari F1 driver Carlos Sainz, they'll be stuck with a watch they can't actually wind or set. Not to worry, Carlos won't have to concern himself with that anymore. Not just because he's leaving Ferrari, but because Bulgari didn't give Mille all that long to celebrate. If you're looking for the thinnest watch in the world, a watch thinner than a hermit's address book, then I've got just the thing for you right here. It's the same watch you saw 2 watches ago, but now it's chronometer certified. Yes, for all intents and purposes, the Bulgari Octo Finissimo Ultra COSC is the same watch. So how is it now also the thinnest? Well, remove that half sheet of paper left by the Mille and you have the 1.7mm thick frame of this new and improved version, reduced by an amount so small it's dwarfed by a human hair. Bulgari took this material from the sapphire crystal, which protruded from the case by the merest amount. This is a really obscure reference, but there's a scene at the beginning of Mickey and the Beanstalk where a starving Mickey cuts a slice of bread so thin you can see through it, and then Donald tries to eat a plate. Anyway, that's about what it was like at Bulgari claiming that record back. At least the NFT is gone. It's replaced instead with a tiny data matrix code on the back which needs an app to use. The next one you'll have to plug in with an Ethernet cable to download the drivers for. The minute repeater will need Sound Blaster 64. If that's the hand that taketh away, the other hand giveth an extra special box that winds and sets the watch for you. Acknowledging that doing so manually is as practical as clipping your toenails with a chainsaw, Bulgari have seen fit to make the Ultra COSC experience as seamless as possible. Bulgari says it's like having a watchmaker at home. I wonder if it'll scratch the lugs changing the strap and leave a hair on the inside of the crystal too. Given the trim profile of this watch, it is impressive that the timekeeping has been certified by COSC for accuracy, although I wonder if they needed to add another position to the standard 5 in testing. Dial up, dial down, crown down, upright, and bent around the wrist like a slap bracelet. The big question on everyone's lips will be the cost of shaving 0.05mm from the sapphire crystal of this record-breaking Ultra COSC. Well, that'll be $600,000. And before you call it a rip-off over the previous Ultra, please know that's only a mere $3,200 per micron. Bargain. Will Bulgari still hold on to the record after data matrix codes become obsolete? Will Richard Mille be inspired by an after-dinner mint that's only wafer thin? Will the Guinness Book of Records guy need a ruler that goes to 3 decimal places? All this and more next time on the thinnest watches in the world. Thanks for watching, and thank you especially to my Patreons who make all this possible. You can join them if you want via the link in the description. And remember, if you're thinking about breaking a world record yourself, filter the existing ones by the age of the record holder. Kids are much easier to beat. See you next time.